Welcome to the 30-second video in the Just In Case series, sponsored by Quality Equality, an OD consultancy firm based in Oxford, United Kingdom. And my name is Mayan, and I'm the founder and the director of the firm. When we first made this series, we want to encourage, particularly during the pandemic, for OD practitioner to engage in lifelong learning, to be refreshed, to be reminded, or to learn something new. And today, this video is all about reminding you and refreshing you, and for you to actually get into the gist of how exciting this framework is. And as you know that all of us use major framework to guide part of our work, and on top of using theory. And the Burke-Litwin framework has been one of the most frequently used framework. So when Professor Burke and I were talking about what should be his second video, I begged him to actually do something simple, simple meaning explaining the Burke-Litwin model from fundamental to explain to us what led to this and what is the intention of the framework, and expecting he would say no because he has so many interesting topics that he would like to share with the world. And to my delight, he said yes. Today, the contributor is Professor Warner Burke, and he needs no introduction as he has done the first video on OD and change management for us. And he is one of the most important guru in the field of OD, and his contribution and his writing. Recently, I did a search of all his writing, and I was dumbfounded by the sheer huge impact he has through his written work to the field of organization development. And so what Warner is doing today is to explain to you, first of all, who is Litwin, because many of us know Burke, but not Litwin. And then he will go on to tell us the context in which he and Litwin partnered together to form this framework. And then he will share the history and the makings and the parts step by step about this model. And I hope that you would enjoy knowing the model you use all the time from a pair of fresh eyes. So Warner, thank you so much for again investing time to share your wisdom with us about this very important framework. Over to you.
Hello, I'm really appreciative of the opportunity that I have been provided here by Mayan and colleagues to talk about, perhaps, I don't know, is it my favorite subject? If it's not my favorite subject, it's pretty close. After all, it bears my name. So the Burke-Litwin model is what I want to explain today. So that's the purpose of our get-together on this video. And I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to be able to do this. And the first question I want to respond to is, who is George Litwin? I mean, every now and then people will say it's the Burke-Litwin model. Well, who the hell is Litwin? So let me explain who my colleague George Litwin is. And he's still alive and well, so I can use the present tense, living the good life up in Massachusetts, which is really his home. It has been his home for many years. George is an organizational psychologist like myself, but he went to the University of Michigan and studied organizational psychology there back in the 60s. And so he's a dyed-in-the-wool organizational psychologist just like myself. So as you can easily imagine, when we first met, we hit it off fairly quickly. Because why? We spoke the same language. When he was at Michigan, he was particularly interested in motivation, and especially the work of Atkinson, but mainly David McClellan. He thought McClellan's work on needs, need for achievement, need for affiliation, and so forth, need for power, sorry, that's the three: power, achievement, and affiliation. So he was enamored with McClellan. And therefore, when he finished at Michigan, he had his heart set on going to Harvard, where McClellan was. And he got a job on the faculty at Harvard, but not in psychology. He was at the business school. So he got a position at the Harvard Business School and was there for quite a number of years. And that's where George made his name, because he did research with MBA students on motivation. And he wanted to be able to predict how motivation affected performance. But he early on realized that the boss of people, the manager, has a tremendous influence on the person's motivation. And so in the workplace. So he started thinking in those terms from the very beginning. George's early work as a scholar was in the research category of what we now know as climate. And he was very interested in how a manager in an organization influenced work unit climate, so the climate of a work unit, and how that climate affected individual motivation, which in turn would predict performance. And so that was the research that he did. And he found, as you would easily imagine, that power and achievement had the most influence, but particularly achievement, which was central to Dave McClellan's work at the time. So he connected with McClellan when he was at the Harvard Business School and continued his research work for quite a number of years. But also during that time, he did some consulting work with an organization in Boston called the Forum Corporation. And the Forum Corporation was a training and development firm founded by Harvard MBA graduates. Who else? It's there in Boston, right? And so George May had a connection with them and worked with them as a consultant from time to time. And eventually they wanted him to come full-time with Forum and become head of R&D. And so that's what he did. He left the business school, went to Forum, and got a very good contract with them and worked with them for quite a number of years. A major contract that the Forum Corporation got in the 70s, late 70s, was with Citibank. We call it Citigroup today. It was called Citibank back then when Walter Wriston was the chief executive officer. And Forum got a contract with them to deliver a program on managing people, because Wriston said at the time, we're very, very good in finance and banking and so forth, but we're terrible in terms of managing people. So give us a program, 5 days. That was in the days when you could have 5 days to do such a thing. You can't do that anymore. Organizations won't sit still for that long. So about as much as you can get away with today is maybe 3 days, maybe, but it's more like 3 hours, actually. Anyway, it's kind of a shame because that program was a dynamite program and lasted for, I don't know, 25 years, something like that. How do I know that? I was involved because the Citibank people knew me. I had done some work with them, and they wanted to bring me in on this Forum contract. So Forum had to hire me, and they didn't know me from Adam. So it was funny. And that's when George and I first met, was with Citibank. And so I began to work with him on the design of that managing people program, and then had a major role in helping to deliver it. So George and I worked together as early as the 70s, late 70s, at Citibank and into the 80s and so forth. Then the Forum Corporation also got a major contract in the 80s with British Airways, when British Airways was going from a government-sponsored organization to a free enterprise, and corporation selling stock on the London Exchange and on the New York Exchange. Now, how did this come about? It was because Margaret Thatcher said so. It was on her mission in life and as prime minister to make business much more central, bring Britain back to its roots, as she said, to small businesses and so forth, but she made it business broadly speaking. So all government organizations that she thought were appropriate were going to go private. And British Airways was the second one that she chose to go private. The first one was aerospace, British Aerospace. It became known as BAE. And I also did some consulting work there. But anyway, I was already working had a connection with respect to British Airways through the head of HR. And the head of human resources at BA at the time was a man named Nicholas Georgiadis. And Nick was a former academic himself at Birkman College. He was a professor there in the University of London for a number of years and produced a lot of doctoral students. So he and I had that background in common. And so he knew me and brought me into BA to work with him and with Colin Marshall, the chief executive officer of BA, to bring about this massive change. And so that was in 1985 when I entered the scene, and I was there for 5 years. So here are George and I working together again. And so the Forum Corporation had developed a training program for British Airways to help them move toward the future. Guess how many days? 5 days. Imagine that. So, so when I entered, that program was being finalized and on the books and being ready to launch. I was not involved with that program personally. My main role was coaching Nick, head of HR, and Colin Marshall, the chief executive officer. And so I was in more of a strategy role, strategy meaning change kind of strategy. And Nick and I spoke the same language. Well, not quite. He spoke British, I spoke American. But we got along famously. He's gone now, and I miss him terribly. But we became very close and worked together very well and so forth. He was very creative, a very creative man. And so he flew me back and forth from New York to London, I don't know how many times, and many of those times was on the Concorde. So I had a very good 5 years with BA. So I left in 1990. And at the time that I entered British Airways, BA at the time was hemorrhaging money. And by 1990, they were the most profitable airline in the world. So do I think that what we did in terms of OD work there happened? Yes, I do. Can I prove it? No. But I'll take those odds any day as enough evidence. So and I consider to this day my work at BA the peak experience of my consulting career. Mainly because I had a good time, but also because we succeeded in terms of what we were attempting to do. George and I and George was there too, and so we overlapped when we were in London many times. And so we would have dinner together and we would consult together and so forth. And a lot of our conversation was trying to understand what it was that we were doing and trying to conceptualize it and put it into some sort of theoretical framework. Being organizational psychologists, both of us, we had a need to try to help understand what it was that was going on and so forth. Thus the birth and formation and origination of the Burke-Litwin model. So the model came from practice. And it came kind of from George and I sitting around and saying, what the hell are we doing? And what is working and what isn't? And how can we explain it to other people to make sense out of it? So that's how it originated. God bless George. And as far as I know, he's in good health and is doing fine, and I hope living the good life, so forth. We had good times together and created the Burke-Litwin model that was published of course, in the Journal of Management in 1992. So that's where the origination of the model was located. Okay, let's go to the to some preliminary remarks before I explain the model. So this might be considered a preamble or some points of view with respect to the models. So first of all, the model is a tool. It's a tool of OD. So it is what OD people need to have, whether it's my model or some other model, but a model to help frame and explain to a client what is going on or not going on, as the case may be. So it's a tool. That's number one. Number two is personal to me. I'm a visual kind of person. So in complicated work, I try to see it, if you understand what I'm trying to say. I try to see what it is that's going on that is conceptual and not obvious to the eye. So I want to put it into another form that I can actually see it. So visualization is very important to me. It's the way I think. And so in my head, I see pictures, or I try to, and how one part of the picture relates to another part of the picture. So it's about pictures, not so much words, although words are very important to me, as you can tell from this presentation, for sure. But seeing things is probably even more important. So that's point number two. Point number three, with respect to a preamble, being a tool and me being visual, OD work, as far as I'm concerned, is primarily diagnosis. I think you should spend the predominant part of your time as a consultant in OD on diagnosis. And you are working all of the time to define the problem. So definition of problem is the ultimate objective of OD work. And in order to adequately define the problem, you have to be a diagnostician. You have to find out what is going on and why. So what is causing what is the content that you're interested in. And what is causing what with the client will decide what needs to be done. You can be helpful as an interventionist in an organization, but that's not your primary work, which may come as a surprise to a lot of people in the field that I think that way, but I do. It's mostly about diagnosis and action research. Now, action research is an intervention, yes, but it's in the purpose of diagnosis. So what you're doing in action research is constantly making some effort at change, collecting data about whether that effort worked or not, modify then what you're doing as a consequence of the data that you collected, and move on to the next step, which is another step of a minor, so to speak, intervention that leads to more action and more research and so forth. That's the cycle. And speaking this way is very timely because in a recent issue of the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science, and I'll give you the reference in just a second, there's a wonderful paper by Bernard Burns, a British guy. Well, he's in Scotland, at the University of Stirling, but everybody in the field of OD knows Bernard Burns, for heaven's sake. He's made tremendous contributions. And so he has written an article that I think is terrific in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science, right here. And it's in so it's 2020, and the volume number is 56, and the first issue of that volume. And the title of the article is The Origins of Lewin's Three-Step Model of Change. The Origins of Lewin's Three-Step Model of Change. You'll have this reference of people at the end of the presentation. But I just wanted to call it to your attention right away because I think it's a tremendously helpful paper in terms of understanding what the work of OD is. And the work of OD is action research. So what Burns explains is how Lewin laid that all out, and that Lewin practiced what he preached. And so Lewin would make small steps, collect data on whether that step worked or not, modify the next step accordingly, and move on in cycles. That's OD work. And it's as much more diagnosis as it is intervention because you're constantly collecting data. And the data are helping you to make the right decisions. It's not bringing in some fancy thing you learned at a conference that you want to try out on this client. No, that's forbidden as far as I'm concerned. You deal with what the client thinks is important to deal with. So what we're trying to do then with action research is deepen the diagnosis, make it much more complicated, which it is, and trying to understand it accordingly. So it's not easy. But again, it's our job to identify the complexity of the organization and the work to be done, and then to simplify that diagnosis and the work to be done using structure to form what? A picture. In other words, a model. So one other just final comment about this preamble part, I guess it's the final comment. I might think of something else, but in any case, stay with me. What we're trying to do is simplify complexity. And so a model helps us to do that. It's hard enough as it is. So a model is to represent everything that I've been saying and is therefore essential to OD work. If you're not using a model in OD work, you don't quite know what you're doing. So it's not just a framework, but a statement of causality as well. So when I get into explaining the model, we'll talk about it from the standpoint of causality, because the Burke-Litwin model is a causal model. It's not a contingency model. So the answer to the model question is not, well, it depends. No, that's not the answer. I'll tell you what it depends on. It depends on what the order is of the pieces of the model and how they're displayed and how they are laid out. So let's go on then. Enough about preamble and giving you much more information about how I think about these things than you really wanted to know, probably. But in any case, it's important for heaven's sake. So let us go to the causal model of an organization in the Burke-Litwin model. First of all, it's a metaphor. So understand the concept of metaphor, that it's a representation of, it's an image of. It's not the real thing. The real thing lies in the hearts and minds of the people who work there. And you try to pull that out, but when you pull it out, you got to pull it out in such a way you can communicate it back to them so that they understand. And you pull it out by interviewing people and observing their behavior and all of that. So that's another form of cycle on the part of the OD consultant. The second thing that's important is the theory on which it is based. So the theory behind and underneath the Burke-Litwin model is open system theory. Now, open system theory we're all familiar with. It starts with input from the external environment, throughput, which leads to output, which leads to a feedback loop that circles back to the external environment or the input again. So that's the cycle of the work. And that comes from open system theory. It comes from biology, not psychology, biology. And von Bertalanffy was the biologist who taught us all of that. And he was a cell biologist, C-E-L-L, not S-E-L-L. I'm doing the selling here as much as I can. But he was a cell biologist, and therefore a cell, a living cell, plant, animal, human, we all are composed of living cells if we're alive. And these living cells constantly reproduce themselves. So cells in our bodies live and die. And in fact, and that's through the cycle that I've tried to explain, input, throughput, output. So what's the input to a cell? Oxygen. And what the cell does is use that oxygen to rejuvenate itself, spews out what it does not need. That's called output, and the cycle continues. And we do that 1 million times a day in our bodies. So the dust in your house is 90% dead cells from your body and other people who came to see you. As disgusting as that may sound. Sorry, but that's reality. And so what you're doing in an organization is you're kind of stirring up that dust. And by the way, when I get to talking about culture, history of the organization is critically important. But more about that in a few minutes. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So the Burke-Litwin model then is based on this way of thinking. Input, throughput, output, and a feedback loop. So that's about as fast as I can explain open system theory that my mouth will allow me. The theory underneath the Burke-Litwin model, as I said, is open system theory. So if that's the case, and it is, where do we start? We start with the external environment, the input to the organization. And if it's a business, the primary aspect of the external environment that we consider is our competition and our marketplace, and what that marketplace is all about. So studying the market, changing technology that's going on in the environment, and government regulations, imagine that, and the economy in general. How strong is the economy going up and down, so forth. And of course, in the example of British Airways, their external environment changed rapidly because they were going to become a business. And therefore, part of their new external environment was not only competition, which they'd always had, but the economy and how to make money in this kind of business and so forth. So all of those kinds of things are in the external environment that the organization must pay attention to. A wonderful synonym for external environment is context. So think of that word as a useful word to help you understand on a broader basis what external environment means. What's the world we live in? What's the context of what it is that we deal with on a day-to-day basis is how to think about it. So that's the input. Then the big bulk of the model is of course, the throughput. And there are 10 categories of throughput. And then the output, of course, you already know, is performance. So the model is displayed top down. So from the top down to the bottom being performance. And then it loops back with the feedback loop back up to the external environment. Because what we do with respect to productivity and performance affects our external environment, or at least we better hope so, meaning beating the competition. So if it's a business, and if it's a pharmaceutical firm, which I have experience with, then it's a lot about research and getting the next vaccine, to speak about a timely kind of thing in our environment today. But let's not go there. That's too depressing. So let's move on then to the top part of the model that is most directly influenced by the external environment are three categories: mission and strategy, leadership and culture. Those are called transformational factors because if you're trying to change any and all of those, you're bringing about massive, comprehensive change to the organization entirely. So the British Airways story is a classic example of transformational change. It was change in all of those categories. So let us begin with mission and strategy. They're in the same box, mission and strategy, but they're distinct from the standpoint of mission is what and strategy is how. So mission is about our purpose. What is our raison d'etre in the world, if a business in the particular business domain that we're in, whatever industry that might be, our role in society, and so forth. So mission is extremely key for people who work there to understand what it is we're up to. Why do we exist and why should we exist and so forth. And so strategy is how you carry out the mission. So strategy is about goals and targets associated with those goals, choices that are made with respect to entering this particular part of the competition as opposed to that part, the kind of service that we provide along with our products if we are a product company. But if we're a service kind of, what kind of service? In any case, all organizations are a service. So it's being clear about what that service is and how we deliver it. So next in the top category of transformational factors is leadership, and that's where you find vision. So this distinction between vision and mission. Mission is the present and the past. Vision is the future. And so the leaders of the organization must provide the vision for the company, for the organization. That's one of their primary responsibilities. Another primary responsibility, of course, is decision making, making the big decisions about whether we're going to be in this market or that market, for example, whether we're going to buy this company or not, whether we're going to entertain a merger or not, and major decisions like that is what leaders do. They're also making decisions about change. So they are in the change business themselves, so to speak. They are the decision makers about that. So as you'll see in a few minutes, that's why George and I separated leadership from management, because we saw leadership as having those kinds of important distinctions and therefore deserved a separate category in terms of importance. Then we move over to the right on the same level of transformational change, and we find culture. Perhaps with respect to OD work, culture is the most important dimension of all. At least I seem to think so in terms of what I've written. I look back at things that I've written. I talk about culture a lot. If you don't change the culture, you're really not going to be able to change the organization in any significant way whatsoever. Another synonym for culture is the same as the synonym for external environment, context. So culture is also context, it's the internal context, and it's the way we do things around here. That's my favorite definition from Kennedy and Deal a long time ago, early 1980s. That's what I think it was in their 82 book, it's how they define culture. The way we do things around here, it makes good sense to me. It's simple, straightforward, and everybody knows what you're talking about. Yep, that's the way we do things here. Well, why? I don't know. We just do it that way. That explains culture right there. So a lot of what we're digging into when we're trying to change the culture is the why. Well, why do you do it that way? So sometimes we have to go way back in the organization and its history to find out why we do things the way we do them today. So history is extremely important in the cultural category to understand how to understand the organization and how to bring about change. So it is also history is also important from the standpoint of the leaders in the organization in terms of their past experience. Do they have any experience about organization change? I mean, I know of an organization right now that's practically next door to me here that is undergoing a major, major change. And the top people have no clue about how to do that. I mean, it's painfully obvious that they don't know what they're doing, although they say they're bringing about change. Well, it's a mess rather than change. So that's what you want to know as an OD consultant. Does the organization have any experience? Do they have any learning embedded within them about how you change things? And especially how you change things in a particular industry. And because the culture is shaped by its industry, for sure. So those are the three transformational factors. And there's where you start if you're beginning with a major OD effort that is going to be organization-wide. You start with those four categories at the top: external environment, mission and strategy, leadership, and culture. So these four classifications, if you will, categories, dimensions, drive everything in the organization. So you think top down. Those four drive what happens in the remaining part of the organization. And so the next most immediate things that they affect are structure, management practices, and systems. And that's why those three are arrayed where they are. They are the ones that are most directly affected by the top four. So structure is the organization design. It's about who reports to whom, who's accountable to whom, and so forth. And it's defined in terms of functions. So a function is marketing, a function is finance, and a function is operations, and so forth, and marketing, sales, and so forth. So those are examples of functions. And so how these functions relate with one another is the structure. And the design of the organization. And that's all a function of the strategy. So the structure is determined by the strategy, not vice versa, which the organization that is in a mess that I was referring to a few minutes ago has started with structure. Absolutely ridiculous. And they're going to get stuck and go nowhere. And I feel badly about it, but never mind. I'm not in charge, and I'm not the consultant. So then we have management practices in the middle and right below leadership. And management practices concerns itself with the specific day-to-day behaviors of managers. For example, the degree of participation in decision-making is a management practice. Just how much involvement do managers execute with respect to people who report to them. So it's the day-to-day work of a particular work unit and its boss. So the boss's behaviors constitute that box, that category. I'll come back to that when I get to climate. But before we go there, let's go to systems, which is the next one in terms of the hierarchy of the model. And systems is very complicated because it's loaded with stuff. So inside systems are policies and procedures that exist in the organization. So what are examples of that? Human resources. So the HR function belongs in systems. So does IT, information technology, or management information system, MIS, whatever the organization calls it. And budgeting. So anything that has to do with policy and procedures belongs in systems. I love the systems box because if I don't know where to put something, I can put it in systems and it'll work. It'll fit. It's your overall garbage can. That's bad of me. I shouldn't put it that way because it may be one of the most important categories in the whole damn model, especially in this day and age when IT is so significant in terms of its influence on the system. But anyway, let me just stop having a little fun here and go and get serious again. Systems is very important, so think about it. All right, then in the middle of the model, right below management practices, is climate. So now you're beginning to see where George Litwin's life began, was management practices, climate, and below climate is motivation, and below that, performance. So that's the spine, as I call it, of the model, right down the middle. And that spine is the most important subcategory of dimensions of the whole model. So from leadership to practices of management to climate, motivation, and performance, that's the spine. Very important categories. So climate is the collective perceptions that people have about how, in a work unit, about how they are being managed. So so when a manager gets feedback about climate, that manager knows exactly how he or she is affecting people. And so, for example, a dimension of climate is clarity. How clear are people about what is expected of them? And particularly with respect to the work unit goals. But what is expected of them in terms of their role in accomplishing those goals? So having standards against which people are evaluated, rather than just arbitrariness, is another dimension of climate. Mutual support, and probably the most important dimension of climate of all is psychological safety. There's a whole body of literature now just on psychological safety in terms of its importance. And one of the early studies that was done about psychological safety was, believe it or not, at Google. And Google spent, 2 or 3 years trying to understand what made teams work and what made teams not work. And the conclusion they finally came to after 2 or 3 years, was it psychological safety? Do people feel safe enough to say what they think is important and not get themselves fired or whatever? Can you be a whistleblower and survive and be safe about it? So it's extremely important. Okay, that's climate. Then the next 3 below climate, and in the order of top down, are task requirements on the left and individual skills and abilities, motivation in the middle, and individual needs and values. So task requirements and individual skills, the best shorthand way to define that is job person match. Do you have the right talent in the right job? If you got that right, you don't have to worry about motivation. It'll pretty much take care of itself. So selection criteria, therefore, are really, really important for decision making. So in that box is where talent management belongs. So in talent management, that's what you're trying to do, is get the right people in the right jobs and get the best talent for the need and so forth. So it's as straightforward and simple as that in terms of, but really important of getting people in the right jobs. So that's why talent management now has become so important and grown so fast, is people have finally understood its importance. Then over to the right is individual needs and values. This concerns the congruence between the degree of congruence that a person's individual values are with the organization's values. So do I believe in what we do as an organization? Do I think it's good? Do I think it's bad? So forth. So my personal beliefs and my personal values, how aligned are they with the organization's culture and with the organization's mission? And the more there is congruence there, the better I'm likely to perform. And once again, motivation will take care of itself. But that leaves out motivation, so let's go there. And so motivation concerns needs, people's needs. So that's McClelland's thinking in terms of how we define motivation, the needs that people have, and the extent to which they are being met. You don't change motivation by trying to change motivation. That's crazy. If you work on either side of motivation, you're more likely to get more highly motivated people. And those are congruence factors. Job-person match are congruence, and congruence of values with the organization and the person. And then finally, there's performance. And what is performance? It's whatever the organization says it is. It's not what I, the consultant, say it is. It's the organization. And so it's all over the place. But in any case, the three major categories are individual, group, and the overall organization. Okay, so performance is what people say it is in the organization. And so those are the transactional factors that we just covered. That is structure, management practices, systems, climate, task requirements, motivation, individual needs and values. So when you're changing those, you're really at the individual day-to-day kind of transactional way of operating. So you're not necessarily, when you're changing there, you're not necessarily changing the organization. You're changing the function, or you're changing certain behaviors on the part of the managers so that you'll get an effect on a certain aspect of climate and so forth. So it's not the totality of the organization. So if you're going into categories, these are the primary ones you would focus on for day-to-day improvement. So that's the day-to-day kinds of changes that happen all the time, but it's focused on functions, specifics, and so forth. All right, finally, let me just talk just a few minutes that we have remaining about use of the model with respect to cases of change. And I've got a couple of 2 or 3 examples, but I won't bore you to death with a big case study here, but just give quick examples. But to start with this, where I went as a consultant from British Airways was to SmithKline Beecham, the merger of 2 pharmaceutical firms located in London and in Philadelphia. And at that time, merger seemed to be an appropriate step to take because the pharmaceutical industry was all over the world. And the largest example was like 13% of the market. And that's really very small for one company to have. So it was ripe for merger and to grow that way. So that was the reasoning. Anyway, I became the external consultant there. Why? Because I met in private with the CEO, Robert Bauman, at the time, and he hired me. And I later found out why he hired me. I didn't know why at the beginning, although I liked him and he seemed to like me, and we got along just fine. But I was hired because he said, "You have a point of view." What was my point of view? The Burke-Litwin model. So I sat down with him when he interviewed me and explained my point of view, which was the model. He loved it. And so I worked there for 3.5 years as a consultant and helped with the merger. And how did the model help? We conducted annual surveys based on the model. So data were collected routinely once a year, and I would go to the top management meetings and feed back the data to the top group of 100 or so, and they would take the data and run with it, and so on. So that's how the model can be used as a diagnostic tool, which I did, but as a way of continuing to diagnose the organization according to these 12 categories, or 12 boxes. Now, before I forget it, let's also be clear, when I said the word boxes, that reminded me, the most important part of the model are the arrows, not the boxes. The boxes are simply categories. How these categories interact is what's most important, and that's what the arrows represent. So all arrows are in both directions, bidirectional arrows in every case, and everything seems to relate with one another. By the way, when I showed this model to an academic colleague of mine years ago, and he had seen it for the first time, he said to me, "Wow, it looks like cowboys and Indians. Look at all those arrows." I didn't like his comment at the time, and I still don't. So if you don't like it, keep it to yourself. I still stand by what I say. That is, the arrows are more important than the boxes. And it's not cowboys and Indians. It's serious business. Anyway, that's the SmithKline Beecham story in brief. And then I went from there to the BBC. By the way, I'm probably better known in the UK than I am in the United States. And I worked with the BBC for almost 5 years. So the BBC conducted, over that 5-year period, an annual survey that was a diagnostic tool, which was based on the Burke-Litwin model of some 100 questions. And they did that annually. That was when John Burt was the Director General, and I was working with him particularly. And he believed in diagnosis and keeping up with all of that by way of the model. So it worked there. And over many years in the United States, thank God for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, because NASA let me do all kinds of survey work with them over in the 1980s and 1990s. So I used the model a lot with them, and so I owe them a debt of allowing me to experiment and learn from them about how to hone the model and the survey work and so forth. And of course, the survey came from British Airways in terms of how we began to think about it originally, George and I. So that's pretty much it. Our understanding of how to use the model with respect to a survey, let me just say to all of you who are listening to me, I am quite happy to see that you get a copy of the Burke-Litwin model survey to use in your own OD work. Just please do not use it for commercial purposes, just for your own research and or your own consulting work in a particular organization. That will go no further than that. So I don't want it to be out on the commercial market, but in the spirit of OD and giving things away, I'm happy to do that. So you can contact me by email and I'll send it, or can contact maybe Mihan and Gopi and they can send it or something like that. Well, thank you very much for spending what seemed like a much longer part than I had planned. But I enjoyed it, and I hope you did too.
On behalf of everyone, I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Warner, for sharing the history of the Burke-Litwin model and all those helpful insights about how to use the model. I'm particularly grateful for you take the time out to detail how the model works and how we practitioners can continue to utilize this model to serve our clients. Thank you for the rich detail and the illustration and the humor you have. And for those of you who want to contact Warner for further discussion, all his details are at the end. And then for me, Warner, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for having done this model that have served us so well so that we can serve our client well. And thank you, audience, for taking the time out. Keep well, keep safe.